first unit we're going to be covering this school year is the From Colonies to Revolution. We will take a brief look at the establishment of the English colonies and then work our way through the causes of the American Revolution, spend a little bit of time on some of the key battles, and more importantly, we're going to look at the outcome. We're going to see where the United States ended up and what the next step was going to be for them after the Revolution. So one of the articles you were given to read on day one dealt with who really discovered America. The idea that Columbus discovered the New World, in most circles anymore, we realize he didn't discover anything. The fact that there were people already here when he got to the New World, that should be a key. That should be a spoiler for you that he didn't actually discover. So, we had the 7 different theories on who could have discovered and, who was here first. And I think that's, an interesting discussion. Some of them have more tangible evidence than others of the different theories. And that's one of the reasons why that's the activity for your journal this time around, is for you to take and pick 5 of those 7 and then rank those 5 and give me a little bit of reason on why you made the decision. But as far as the discovery, the timing of those plays a role in this, as well as who's writing this history. And this is when we start talking about the Eurocentric nature of our history. When Columbus landed in the New World, other countries followed. It's the beginning of that age of exploration in our hemisphere. And it's because Columbus started that he gets credit for the discovery. It's the fact that we're giving him the credit, and he was turned into a hero early on. I said not so much today in a lot of aspects of American society. There are some places who were they do nothing but denounce Columbus, but he was given that credit because everyone followed, because he was the first, and the Europeans are going to win this battle for control of the New World, the battle with the Native Americans. So again, history is written by the winners. Unfortunately, that means that sometimes the losers side of it gets lost in the translation. It gets lost in the presentation, or just completely ignored. So that's, again, Columbus getting the credit is based on who got to write the story, and the story was written by us. One of the things that does happen with the Columbus exchange, he did make several trips, and again, he did begin that process where lots of other explorers are going to be making the way west and opening up this new world. We see an exchange not just of products. We're going to see exchange in livestock. We're going to see an exchange in we're going to see exchange in food products, things of that nature. We're also going to see an exchange in ideas. Cultural diffusion is what we used to call it, many years ago. I don't know if that's still the term they use today, but that's going to develop. And as I said, the more we see the exchange, the more there are things in these new colonies that Europe wanted, the more people, the more money was going to be spent to acquire it, and the more people trying to acquire. So as far as what role did Columbus play in the beginning of American colonies, he didn't really land in North America. He didn't really establish in a colony that became part of us just yet. But he did force the other countries to get involved, because Spain and Portugal to follow, they are going to make a lot of money. And from 1492 to 1588, Spain was a world power. Bottom line. They won the jackpot. They were the lottery winner, so people were going to pay attention to that. So the British aspect in this really kind of started back in 1588. In the last slide, it said 1492 to 1588. 1588 marks kind of the transfer of power. It's the changing of the guard. It's that where the Spanish stopped kind of being the world power and England started to become that world power. And it all stems around the state-sanctioned pirates used by by the English to attack the Spanish galleons that were laden with gold and very big slow ships, not as well defended as they probably should have been because they were full of gold, and the Brits were attacking those. And in 1588 was the final showdown where the Spanish sailed their armada up to England and they were defeated by the English. Their ships were too big and too slow. The Brits were more maneuverable, and they knew the lay of the waterways of the English Channel, and there was some bad weather and all that. But with the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, it kind of signaled the beginning of English dominance. So the English had already been exploring, and they weren't the only ones that had been exploring, but they had worked their way down from Newfoundland and through Maine and around our northeast, and we'd been trying to find a lot of the different, a lot of the different explorers were trying to find the Northwest Passage, that mythical waterway that was going to link, the east coast to the west coast, because in the end they're still trying to get to China. They're still trying to get to the Spice Islands. They still think that there could possibly be a route through this landmass that is North America that could get them to where they were actually trying to go. Because let's not forget, Columbus wasn't sailing for the New World. Columbus was trying to find a faster route to Asia. So there is no Northwest Passage, with the exception of those that made their way through the Great Lakes, ended up in the Mississippi River, and then came out in the Gulf of Mexico and then circled right back into the Atlantic. All the explorers are going to end up at the fall line, as they're going to follow the rivers into the east coast of the United States. There's only so far you go before you start hitting the waterfalls. That's the fall line. So when they couldn't find the route through, the next step is about the establishment of colonies. Now this slide with showing the map gives you a little bit of an idea of the different countries that were involved: the Dutch, the English, the French, the Portuguese, Scandinavian, Spanish. Gives you a time frame, gives you locations. So this whole age of exploration, which is something if you took Western Civ you should have talked about, if you took World Cultures probably not so much, but Europe was intrigued by what Columbus had quote unquote discovered. But again, after 1588, the people that are going to be kind of driving this, the country that's going to be in charge of this is going to be Great Britain, or at least they're going to be the more dominant force in this new world area. Now, when we start talking about why did Britain establish colonies there in America, why did colonists choose to leave Europe and make their way on that trek across the ocean and try to carve out an existence in an unknown land? And usually we like to throw out the answer, well, it was for religious freedom. That's the feel-good answer. You understand, we called the people who landed in Plymouth Rock off the Mayflower, we call them pilgrims. Well, the term pilgrim wasn't used until the 1880s. The pilgrim, comes from pilgrimage. It has that religious connotation, and it was, again, we were trying to kind of rewrite the history. Now, I'm not saying the Pilgrims didn't have a religious reason for leaving England. They didn't like the religion as it was going on in England. But what they created is not religious freedom, so therefore it's hard to say that's the number one reason. And we've got other colonies than just the one the Pilgrims landed at. The reality, which, again, it's the ugly truth, most colonists who left Europe coming to the New World, coming to what would become the Americas, were doing so for money. They were doing so for an economic opportunity. Like the article we had for Who Really Discovered America, and one of the groups that talked about how the European tradition of the oldest son gets everything and the younger son's got nothing, and the younger son's then seeking that adventure. That was still the case in a lot of European countries through this time period. So you had people who didn't have an opportunity for land. You had people that were locked in a strict caste system in their society with the haves and have-nots, the rich, the poor. They weren't going to get an opportunity to rise above their station unless they left and went to the New World. So the economic aspect of why they came to the Americas far outweighs that of the religious aspect. Again, it's not what we're typically taught. But you're looking at one colony who never actually established religious freedom at that time. They established a colony based on a religion, and they were not very tolerant. That's not religious freedom to me. The real reason? About the money. Now, our first attempts at colonization are going to happen in the South. Again, Plymouth Rock and the Pilgrims weren't even the first ones that are going to attempt the permanent settlement. First attempts happened off the coast of North Carolina in what is known as Roanoke. This is the whole lost colony. 1587, Sir Walter Raleigh landed a crew, established a settlement. When they went back to England for supplies, they got caught up in the Spanish Armada and the fight there, and they didn't get back to Roanoke till like 1590. And something happened between 1587 and 1590 to where they disappeared. Next attempt is in 1607, and this is what we call Jamestown. King James I was the king at the time, so as they're sailing up the James River and they make their, and of course we named it the James River after King James, they establish their settlement there, and we call it, Jamestown after King James. But this is the one that was made famous through the story of Pocahontas, and I'm sure you've seen the movie. Disney did a fantastic job making that kid friendly and all that. Not necessarily historically accurate, but people at least can relate to the story itself. But before they left England, though, they did utilize this idea of a joint stock company. I do feel we need to just briefly talk about this. Joint stock companies are simple. It's where you buy stock in the company. Investors pooled their resources through the stock company to fund the expedition, and all the king and all the court had to do, all the royal court had to do, was issue the charter saying they had the right to go do this in the name of England. Here's a flag to sail under. We're there for your protection. We're going to get a percentage of this, but the risk was on those investors. So for England, the risk was minor. For the investors, the risk was major. But again, the reward they thought was going to be major as well, because they'd seen Spain, they'd seen Portugal reap the benefits of colonization. So let's go do this. Now again, you know the story. We struggled at first. We didn't bring the right kind of people. We weren't farmers. We weren't craftsmen. We weren't carpenters. And we were trying to dig for gold, and we're going to get in some trouble. Pocahontas is going to help us out. John Smith's going to lay down the law with his "those who will not work will not eat," and he's going to kind of force the colony into surviving for that first year, 2 years. And once they survive those first initial years, every year you get more supplies, every year more people. It's just a matter of, they weren't finding the gold, they weren't finding those resources they thought they could, get rich off of until 1612. And that's when John Ralph has, tobacco seeds, and we discover the brown gold. We discover that tobacco can grow in this climate, in this soil, and can flourish. Now, the Columbus Exchange had already introduced tobacco into England and into Europe, and we wanted it there. Again, tobacco's addictive, even without the added chemicals that came from big tobacco over the years. Tobacco in itself, people liked and they wanted, so there was a market for this product. And next thing you know, they're exporting 1.5 million pounds per year by the 1620s. And once they established the cash crop, that is where we start seeing North Carolina, South Carolina, and the other southern, and middle and southern colonies establishing themselves as these agricultural-based economies where they were exporting cash crops to England. I mean, it's going to be tobacco, it's going to be cotton, it's going to be rice, it's going to be indigo. We had a variety of products where we were able to grow them here and sell them to England. So the prospect of turning a profit in the colonies began to grow, if I can get away with saying that. So that's where we start getting the Virginia colony. And again, the larger the colony got, they're going to have the more people that get there. The larger the exportation is, the more the demand is going to grow. Then we run into the problem: where's the labor force going to come from? Okay, it's about the labor. Needed to grow more, tobacco to make a bigger profit. So they started what we call the headright system. Headright system is pretty simple. For every colonist, and you can read this, I'm just going to read it right off the screen with you. Colonists, 2 headrights, 50 acres. So you come over, you get the 2 headrights. Immigrant colonists who paid their passage, given 1 headright. Individuals who would receive 1 headright each time they paid passage for another individual. So if you came over, you received land. If you paid for someone to come over, you received land. Now, problem with this, you're starting to get more and more people who own the property. That means the individuals who were already there, they want to expand their property rights as well, because I'm growing 50 acres worth of tobacco here, I can make X number of dollars. Well, I want to make more than that, so I need more acres of land. But if we keep with the headright system, we just keep giving everybody else this land, and I want more. And we started to see a shift to what's called the indentured servant. And this is where your landowners in Virginia would pay the way for someone to come over, but they didn't get land. They didn't receive a headright. What they received is a contract. And because I paid your way over, you're going to work for me. Usually it's 7 to 10 years. And during that time, you work for me, you live with me, I feed and clothe you, but I don't pay you. And then at the end of our contract, you're free to go. Now, can I hire you on as a hired hand then and continue to have you working for me? Yes, but then I have to actually pay you. If I don't want to do that, I bring in another indentured servant. Well, the problem with this system is you start getting these indentured servants who are now free of their contract, and the skill they have could be growing tobacco, and they want to grow their own. They want to get in on the profits as well. So the farmers were looking for a way to bring in workers that weren't eventually going to be free to seek their own land and seek their own profits, and that's where the slavery comes in. First slaves showed up in Virginia in 1619. It was purely by accident. A ship showed up with the African slaves in it. The slave trade itself been around since the 1400s. The Portuguese, the west coast of Africa, had been going on for a couple hundred years, or 150 years at this point, something like that. And it was a natural fit. It was just the progression. But this progression from headright system to indentured servants to African slaves was driven by one thing, and it was driven by profit. I can pay X number of dollars to bring an indentured servant over, but I'm going to have to do that every 10 years. And after those people are freed, they're going to want their own land, and that's going to cause problems for me because that land is to the west. Indians are in the west. I don't want to stop doing what I'm doing to fight a war so somebody else can get land. So we go to the slaves. It's a one-time payment. And then you start getting into the idea that once you have enough slaves, then you are actually then creating and breeding your own slaves. And that's when we get the slave trade that starts to happen within the colonies itself, not just getting them from Africa. So the economics drive that. And we saw that come to a head in 1676, this whole economic clash between haves and have-nots, when groups of these landless farmers who were trying to push west into Virginia were having conflicts with the Native Americans, and when the wealthy aristocratic class that was being developed in Virginia, the plantation owners, if you will, refused to help them, refused to fund the war, refused to participate in these conflict with Native Americans over land, our landless farmers stopped attacking the Indians and started attacking the wealthy. They started attacking the plantations. It's the first time we see this clash of classes, really, in colonial history. Alright, so when we talked about Massachusetts Bay Colony, we said they established a fairly strict, religious, theocratic style government. Church members having the right to vote and non-church members not having the right to vote. Not everybody in the colonies believed the same thing. There were going to be those who did quote-unquote dissent. And it's from some of these individuals that we see some of the other colonies in New England become established. Rhode Island, for instance. This traces its history back to Roger Williams, member of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, who had some issues with the church there, dealing with the way they punished, the way they handled the settlers, just some general religious aspects. But he was asked to leave, ordered to go back to England, and instead he ended up in what is now Narragansett Bay in Rhode Island, where he negotiated with the Indians and established his own colony. John Wheelwright's going to do some of the same things. He's going to lead a group out in Newfoundland, New Hampshire. Anne Hutchinson, one of my personal favorites of these dissenters, her primary, the thing that got her in trouble, her primary thing that she was guilty of was she was a she. The fact was, in this time period, women weren't supposed to be vocal leaders in the church, and she challenged the church leadership. Basically, if you can read the Bible, you can interpret it for yourself. You really didn't need the clergy. Well, the ministers and the like were always well-respected leaders of the community, leaders of the church, and for someone to come out openly and saying things like they don't need them in order to have that relationship with God, they considered it blasphemy. And she's another one that's going to be ordered or be asked to leave, and she will end up in Rhode Island as well. Connecticut gets a special mention here, not necessarily because of the dissenting by leadership that created it, but because they left more along the lines or more along the reasons they were looking for land. And again, as you get thousands of people starting to move into that region, the need for land, the want for some living space itself, caused other groups to move on and kind of carve out their own area. And Thomas Hooker moved into what became Connecticut. And one of the big things with Connecticut, or one of the main reasons we mention it, is they actually took the time to create a written constitution. And it's the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, says there on the screen, 1639. But it's the first written constitution in the colonies. When I was talking about the Mayflower Compact the other day in class, we were talking about the fact that one of the classes I called it the Promise Ring, because the Mayflower Compact, historically, people give a lot of attention to. It's a big deal, but all the Mayflower Compact said was that they would eventually form a government. Well, Connecticut actually did. They created the government. So the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, they wrote it down. It's a written constitution, which, again, unlike that of England. England doesn't have a written constitution. They still follow the whole common law system, where it's just the compilation of the laws over the years. So Connecticut gets that special, gets some attention here. not necessarily just because of the dissenter aspect, the space-seeking aspect, and created another colony, but they created one and then they wrote a government to go with it. Now, New York and New Jersey are a little different in the way that it's going to be settled. This is a gift. Prior to English involvement, New York and New Jersey was a Dutch settlement. This was New Netherlands. Henry Hudson, who was an Englishman actually, sailing for the Dutch, had been exploring the New York region as early as 1609, 1610, somewhere in there. And they began a fairly prosperous fur trade with the natives. Trading posts were built in along the Hudson River. In 1620s, they established the Dutch West India Company and granted charters, and they created this colony that became the New Netherlands with a capital of New Amsterdam, which is, of course, today's New York City. But then it was New Amsterdam. It was a fairly diverse colony, but they were slow to attract Dutch settlers. So instead of just kind of languishing without enough colonists, they began openly recruiting and trying to settle a large variety of people. So within this New Netherlands, you're going to have Dutch settlers, German settlers, French settlers, Scandinavian, and a plethora of other Europeans, blacks, both free and slave. They typically had a religious tolerance there, which drew a lot of different faiths. And for the most part, they had a friendly working trading relationship with the natives. But when you looked at the English map of the New World, they have this, Massachusetts Bay, you've got Connecticut, you've got Rhode Island, you've got New Hampshire, are all settled by English. You've got them below them, Virginia, the Carolinas taking shape. They needed that land in between. We haven't talked about it yet, but Pennsylvania, 1660s, same time frame that England was settling in Pennsylvania as well. The English tended to refer to this New Amsterdam as the Dutch wedge. It's that wedge on the map that they didn't control. So in 1664, the King Charles II, gave his brother permission to go and oust the Dutch. And when it came time for the Dutch settlers to rally around the flag, to pick up arms to defend the Dutch colony, there was no real loyalty to the Dutch flag. There was no loyalty to the leadership there because they were such a diverse colony. So when the British came a-knocking, the Dutch gave up without a fight and just kind of handed the colony over. New Amsterdam becomes New York City. The New Netherlands becomes New York, the colony. And James then later gave a couple of his friends what we now know as New Jersey. So while the others, we've got the economic interest in Virginia with the planting, the cash crops. You've got the Puritan aspect in New England. This was one motivated because of the potential profits of the trading in the Hudson, but also it kind of completes the set, if you want to think of it that way. But they called it that wedge. They wanted that piece, so 1664, the king sent his brother and he took it. Now these two colonies, I've got them lumped together because they're acquired by these families for the same reasons. In Pennsylvania, William Penn is the man. We know that, William Penn, and that's one of the more obvious names when you're asked to connect the name with the colony. But his father had loaned the king money at some point in time, so there was a debt owed by the king. Kings are not notoriously liquid in their assets, meaning they don't keep a lot of cash on hand. It's more their power is based on the title. It's based on the land. So it was not unusual for kings to repay debt with land, and that's what we get with Pennsylvania. The Penn family were Quakers, saw this as an opportunity to create a place where the Quakers could come and worship the way they wanted, without dealing with some of the well, they were mistreated without dealing with some of the English royal aspects. Here's the thing: one of the beliefs the Quakers had is, they did not believe in the idea of royal families. They didn't, believe in the idea of different people having, the different stations in life, and because they had that, belief in England, they were going to be persecuted. So Penn family opens Pennsylvania up, and again, it's this idea of a holy experiment. And again, he treated the natives well. They negotiated for land and made deals, recruited people from across the continent of Europe, and it's going to see a diverse population there as well. But it's based around this idea of, the Quakers having that religious tolerance. In Maryland, instead of the Penns, it's the Calverts. There, it's that Chesapeake Bay area. We had the map quiz in week 1 with Maryland, and you should, the Chesapeake Bay coming into Maryland there. This was supposed to be a safe haven for Catholics. Now, their problem is going to be that eventually, as they're growing as a colony, there's not enough Catholics. They're going to be outnumbered. As the Protestant Reformation had moved forward, the Catholics began to be persecuted in England, much like the Protestants had been persecuted. So Catholics were coming, but there weren't enough to fill the colony, and the government was afraid that the place that was supposed to be a safe haven for Catholics was going to be overrun by Protestants, and the Catholics would be persecuted here as well. So they get some special shout out here because of the legislation they passed. Toleration Act of 1649 was the first act of any kind of colonial government that enabled this idea of religious freedom. So when we talk about why did people come to the colonies, again, the idea of religious freedom is always one, it's high on the list, but we really don't see that until Maryland in 1649. This is it's where we get actual legislation where they're saying all religions are tolerated. So Pennsylvania, Maryland, both based on tolerance. Both were colonies that were land tracts that had been given to families because of debts owed to them by the king. So there's those similarities there. Georgia's a little different. In England at this time, as we're in the early 1700s, one of the problems that they were dealing with, especially in London, was the idea of the urban poor, the homeless people, and vagrants, and there were debtors' prisons that were filling up. And for England, they were an eyesore. But at the same time, there wasn't a lot they could do. There wasn't a lot they wanted to do to deal with it. That's where James Oglethorpe comes in. Oglethorpe believed that those people deserved a second chance. He thought that for the most part, those people were misunderstood, possibly. Maybe they just had a run of bad luck. For whatever reason, he believed that they needed a second chance, and he was going to be the guy to give them that second chance. He just needed the land to give him that opportunity. And so he's going to approach the king with the idea of giving him some land. Now, the crown has some different ideas. While giving these people a second chance, okay, whatever. Let's be honest, if the king, the crown, if the court, if the English government really wanted to give them a second chance, they would have done it themselves. But they saw this as an opportunity. Now you need to visualize the map of the colonies at this point. Where Florida is on our southern, east coast. During this time period, Florida really isn't, it isn't being governed by anyone. Technically, it's Spanish, but the Spanish government doesn't really have a lot of control. You've got escaped slaves. You've got Native Americans who were, resisting the colonial governments, and you have pirates. You have those types of people down there. And they were making it rough on the southern colony of South Carolina. Now, South Carolina was a very prosperous colony for England. Now, if you look at the map, you see there is a piece of land between what is Florida now and what is South Carolina. It's present-day Georgia. And what the government decided, what England decided, was that's the best tract of land for Oglethorpe to attempt this, because it would create a buffer between the pirates of the pirates of Florida and the South Carolina seaports. If the pirates and the like, they were going to raid villages and attack and whatever, they could attack Georgia and leave South Carolina alone. So Oglethorpe has these high-minded ideals for what he wants to see happen. Again, it's a social experiment. He's going to give them rules and regulations. He's going to give them land. He's going to give them guidance. He's going to give them education. He's going to give them religion. He's going to give them all this stuff. This second chance at a new beginning in the new world. Englanders primarily focused on the fact that it's a buffer colony. Oglethorpe's vision doesn't ever really materialize. People don't like the structure. They don't like the rules and all that. And eventually Georgia's is going to be a royal colony in which the crown is going to continue to populate with people that they just soon would rather not be in England, and the hopes that something catches. And it's going to turn into be an agricultural economy, just like that of South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia. Today it's the peach state. Peanut plantations and pecans, and if you've ever driven to Florida, you've seen all the stands. I mean, it's an agricultural state still, but it didn't start out that way. It started out as this idea of a social experiment. Now, that for the most part is all we're going to deal with is specific colonies. And again, from Virginia down to Georgia, you're going to see economies develop based on cash crops that can be exported. You get into Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, you'll see some agriculture, but you're going to see other things dealing with the shipping industry. You're going to see timber. You're going to see shipbuilding, especially as you get into the New England colonies. They're more subsistence farming, and they will begin in the 17s to dabble in manufacturing. But we're not going to get into any of the other specific colonies. Now we're going to move into more of the relationship with the Native Americans, as well as just the general method in which the English are going to rule their colonies. The British attitude towards the Native Americans was simple. It was path of least resistance. If they could negotiate and get what they wanted from the Native Americans, they would. If they could buy, trade, they would. But if the terms of the deal weren't right, if they couldn't negotiate a deal that they believed was best, their best interest, then they would just take things. So from the beginning, the Native Americans, they're going to be at a disadvantage. We talked a little bit about this plague. The article you guys read, the first. I've just lost the title in my head. Hate it when that happens. First encounter. My goodness. When we read the article, the first encounter, he talked about they mentioned a pox of some sort. We talked about some other historical and sources and whatever who aren't really sure what it was. There are some that believe that it was a divine intervention. Whatever happened between 1616 and 1619, the Native Americans, especially in the New England area, took a hit to their numbers, and it was because of some kind of an illness. The colonists also had a technological advantage because they had gunpowder. They've got weapons that now again. We're not talking about repeating rifles and machine guns. We're still talking about flintlocks, matchlocks, and those types of weapons. But they do have a lot of bang for the buck. They've got cannons. They've got those types of weapons that were devastating. And if used properly, they could wreak a lot of havoc on the Native Americans, and the British were typically pretty good at it. As far as the treatment, again, we've got all kinds of evidence that situations where natives and colonists got along. And then we have situations where and again, it varies and it's going to go in cycles. Um, were we using and abusing the privileges given to us by Native Americans early on? Were we taking advantage of them? Did they get tired of helping us, and then there's a pushback, and then we push back again? There's an ebb and flow to our relationship with the Native Americans, again, especially in New England. You get this old deal with ownership of land. They don't believe in ownership of land. We've got the deed from the king. So there's a fundamental issue. Whenever they realize that we weren't there just to trade, we were there to establish ourselves, we become a threat to their way of life. So there's going to be that conflict. Two main wars that took place in this early period of colonization. One is the Pequot War up in Connecticut, that's 1630s. Pequots were at war with the Narragansetts, and that was a tribe that we were friendly with, so we helped them out. And in the big battle, it took place at Mystic River as a Pequot camp, and the way the story's told, there were over 400 men, women, and children in that camp, and when we stopped, there were only 4 or 5 left. We killed them all. We killed the men, the women, the children, the elderly. Killed everybody. And it said that this left such an impression on the Narragansetts who we were fighting with that it terrified them. But this sent a message, and this is what the British did. It's cold, it's calculating. But they sent the message, don't mess with us, because we will kill every last one of you. And for 30, 40 years, we don't see any real problems take place. There's not a lot of major conflicts after this happened, for this, next generation. And then we come into King Philip's War. Now, King Philip is a Wampanoag chief. His name is Metacom, but we called him King Philip. The King Philip's War started in the spring of 1675, and the Wampanoags were very good at their guerrilla tactics, and they would attack the settlers on the western frontier. They burned outlying settlements. They attacked with some, a ferocity. And within months, they were attacking Boston. And the colonial response was simple. They killed as many Native Americans as possible. That was it. Kill, 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 kill. The war itself lasted around a year. Between food shortages, disease, and heavy casualty numbers, the natives were going to be forced to flee further inland or to surrender. Now, the colonists suffered. They suffered losses of up to 10% of their male population. But in the end, Metacom was killed. He was decapitated, and his head was placed on display on the outskirts of town. They put his head on a stick, basically, and stuck that out in the city limits of Plymouth for about 20 years. And Native American power in that region was gone forever. Now, why do you put cut somebody's head off, put it on a stick, and put it outside of town? Again, it's a message. Don't mess with us. This is how the British dealt with the Native Americans. Negotiate if you can, fight if you must, and in the end, we have to be the English belief. They're superior, they have to win, and you win at all costs. Now, the English rule of the colonies, early on, very hands-on. Now, the king, he issued charters, and the various kings, as we move through this period, they issued charters. They gave people permission to take land, and whenever possible, they would acquire the territory for themselves as royal colonies. But the government aspect, they wanted control. Now, the British bought into this economic philosophy that is known as mercantilism. And this is one of those questions that shows up on final exams periodically. The idea of what is mercantilism. It is an economic philosophy in which a nation's power is based on its wealth. So, you want to be a powerful nation, you need to be a wealthy nation. Now, the wealth would also then provide you opportunities that less wealthy countries would have, like big armies, big navies, and the like. So, in a mercantile system, your colonies exist to benefit you. That's the point of having a colony, is to make a profit off the colony. And you had to establish this favorable balance of trade with your colonies. You always make more money off of a colony than you spend on a colony. I mean, that's the point. So early on, the British were very involved to make sure they were making, maximizing profits. We had a series of acts that they issued in the 1650s called the Navigation Acts. Now, I'm just going to give you 4 pieces and parts here. There's going to be other things to this, but these are the ones that I think are the most important, or just more significant, if you will. They forbade all trade with colonies, other colonies, except on ships that were owned by either colonial businesses or English. So basically, you have to ship your products on an English ship. It can either be owned by a colonist or owned by somebody in England itself. But again, England has to benefit from the shipping of the product. The ships themselves had to have at least a crew of 75% Englishmen. So English workers had to be benefiting from the trade of these goods. There were some products that trade was limited to just England. So let's just use tobacco as an example. Say tobacco was on that list. If you were a tobacco farmer in Virginia, the only place you could legally sell your product was to England. So England was going to set the price. Then England would resell it to anybody they wanted to and maximize their profits. And then lastly, if you were allowed to trade a product with another country, it first had to pass through an English port. So the point of all that is, England was going to get theirs. Period. It was about the profit. Because again, it's a mercantile system, power based on wealth. They were going to extract as much wealth as they could from the colonies, any way that they could from the colonies. Now, in the 1680s, we started to see some, upheaval in the government in England. It's their glorious revolution. And while that happens, there'd been a crackdown in New England. It's when they actually, this is where the name New England comes from. They kind of revoked all the charters of Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and they called that whole area the Dominion of New England. And it's not going to be until after that's kind of broken back apart that we end the whole model colony thing in Massachusetts. But the Glorious Revolution, England's going to have their hands full there with some turnover in the government. They're fighting amongst themselves there. And for us, we are going to benefit greatly because this is what brought on the policy of salutary neglect in regards to the American colonies. So, the period of salutary neglect, one of my favorites. I'm probably the only person in this hallway that gets excited when he talks about salutary neglect. But this is where we learned how to be a country. This is when our colonial assemblies learned how to make democracy work. I tell people every year, democracy is hard work. It is one of the hardest forms of government to get people to embrace. Now that sounds kind of silly to us because we've grown up in this world, this country, where we've championed this idea of democracy and the idea of a democratic republic where we elect our officials and we make those decisions and we have the freedom to vote and all that. The reality is, when people aren't used to making their own decisions, they have a difficult time grasping the concept and then putting it into practice. Just take a look at what's been going on in the Middle East. After we were in Iraq and we tried to establish a democratically elected government there, look at all the problems they've continued to have. Because it's a region of the world where they've never had the choice. They've never had that option. People have to be eased into this. This period of salutary neglect is when we got eased into it. From the 1690s through the 1750s, we were given a level of autonomy here in the colonies that allowed us, on a colony by colony basis, to learn how to make these decisions. Did we make mistakes? Yes. Did we learn from the mistakes? Absolutely. And because our mother country, because England had given us this increased responsibility, and again, it wasn't just all at once in 1690, boom, England left us alone. It's a gradual thing. But again, by the 1730s and 40s, we were running ourselves for the most part. We were in our colonies, which had always been colonial assemblies, but they really didn't have much authority. And now, by the time we get to the French and Indian War period of the 1750s, our colonies, our colonial governments, are acting kind of like a state government would today. And it's an amazing transformation. It's an amazing evolution of our government that doesn't take place unless England gives us the chance for this to take place. Now, I've often referred to the period of salutary neglect as the college years, because when you're in high school, living with your parents, they set the rules. They set the bedtime. They set what's for supper. They set when you do your homework. They set how much data you get on your phone. They set the rules. They even tell you who to date and who your friends can be sometimes, or they try to. But you get the classic, my house, my rules. Well, then you graduate high school and you go to college. Now, mom and dad's house is still your permanent address. You still live there. Kind of like the colonists were still English. But now we're living in a dorm somewhere. There's nobody to tell us when to go to bed. There's nobody to hound us about, did you get your homework done? There's nobody to hound you about, make your bed, wash your dishes, or do anything else. We get to make our own decisions. Now, when kids go off to college, do they always make the right decision? No. Do they learn a valuable lesson in the progress, or in the process? Yes. That's what we did as colonies. We made mistakes, learned our lesson, and we moved forward. That's what happened. That's what happens in those college years, but it's what happened to our colonies in the salutary neglect period. Now, if you want to say, well, how does that get us to the revolution? Think about when the college graduate comes back home after graduating college. They've had 4 years, 5 years, some people 6. But they've had that period of time where they had that freedom. And now all of a sudden, my house, my rules. That's kind of a problem. Now, why would England do all this? Again, it is a standard policy, been in place since the 1620s. Once they established the colonies, once they got the rules going, once they established that favorable balance of trade, as long as colonies were continuing to manufacture, to produce, do whatever it is they do to make money for the government, they left us alone. So again, we got this because we were continuing to be profitable. But it is going to kind of backfire on them because we're going to really, really, really like this idea of freedom. We're going to like this idea of democracy. And after the French and Indian War, we're going to start being that kid moving back home that doesn't necessarily want to be back home anymore. Our conflict with the French, it comes down to a situation where we're going to both claim the same territory. French settlers, they were more adventurers. They were more young men, young single, teens, 20-somethings looking for an adventure. And they would come to this new world. They came in through Canada, the Great Lakes, the Mississippi River, Ohio River valleys, and it was about the fur trade. And they weren't really settling like England was. The French territory was much larger but at the same time, it was much less, densely populated. England was much more organized with its settlement. France, it was about their network of fur trading and trappers and trading posts and all that. French had a much different relationship with the Native Americans. While they still had that European opinion that of themselves that they were superior to the natives, they were much less likely to get involved in the natives' affairs unless they were getting involved with the natives' affairs, because we did have some Frenchmen who did marry into the tribes themselves. But they weren't there for cultural change. They weren't there necessarily to take their land. They were there to make a profit off the land and move on. So the conflict that we're going to see with the French comes from they're both going to be claiming the same territory. And we call it the French and Indian War because the Native Americans tended to fight with the French, especially early on. During the early stages of our conflict that was developing with the Native Americans with the French, leaders from several of the colonies met together in 1754 to discuss the possibility of coming together as a colonial unit. This is where we get the Albany Plan of Union. Now, Benjamin Franklin, who was probably the most famous person in the colonies at this time, he's going to be the author of the Albany Plan of Union. Now, he wasn't even really a big fan of it himself, but he said, he didn't think we needed to come together as one, the colonies coming together as one government. But he also was able to take his personal feelings, set them to the side, and then create this idea. Now, for a long time, and in a lot of the U.S. history classes I've taken in my life, they were very leery of giving credit to anybody else for Franklin's idea. Benjamin Franklin created this just out of his own head. I mean, he was the brains behind this because he's one of our founding fathers. Reality is, he got a lot of this idea from watching the Iroquois. I mean, there's a part of American history we don't want to give the Native Americans credit for having any part of our democracy. But the reality is we base some of this early ideas about each individual colony would give up a little bit of power to the collection of the whole. And, they'd come together for trading. They'd come together for defense. Well, that's what the Iroquois Confederacy had done. And they'd been around for a long time. So, Benjamin Franklin was a student. He was a very smart man. He was a lifelong learner. There's no way he could have been around the Iroquois Confederacy and not notice this style of government, and then he used that as a plan for the Albany Plan of Union. Now, Albany Plan of Union is not accepted by the colonies because they didn't want to give up some of their individual rights as colonial governments. England was never going to go for it either because England was not going to give up its own control or any control itself. Albany Plan of Union is significant because it's the first time we really begin to discuss the idea of the colonies becoming a government of their own. And that's 1754. That's 22 years before we get to the Declaration of Independence. And you get a cool little political cartoon there, the Join or Die. So, for the French and Indian War, we did the activity in class where you had the write-ups to read through and then the questions to answer. But just kind of give you a timeline here. 1750s, disputed land. 53, the French build Fort Duquesne. That's around present-day Pittsburgh in western Pennsylvania. Now, at that time, Virginia was claiming that land, and the governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, sent a young George Washington to deliver a message, and the message was simple, and it was get out of our territory. That's going to lead to an altercation. Washington shows up. He runs into a French patrol. They defeat said French patrol. Now Washington's forced to build his own fort, Fort Necessity, and calling it a fort is a stretch. It wasn't much of a fortification. But for 2 years then we had this undeclared war going on in the frontier between colonists, colonial militias. We'll see some, they will send some British regulars, but it's an undeclared war. July 3rd of 54, Washington gets defeated. They take his fort. He's forced to retreat. He's, just, distraught and in despair that he has failed, and he resigns his commission, and he's, going to, not be a member of the militia anymore. Fortunately, he got past that, got back on the horse, because we're going to need him in the military capacity later. And some of the lessons he learned during the French and Indian War will help us when we get to the Revolution. So in 1755, British are getting involved. They're going to send General Edward Braddock, and Braddock's regular army. He's got his 2,400 troops there. They've got their bright red coats on with the shiny gold buttons, and their big long, rifles with the bayonets and all that. British military has a reputation at this point in time. It's shock and awe. The tight formations and the well-disciplined troops. They were victorious throughout Europe during the period, and they were going to come and they were going to teach these Frenchmen and these Indians a lesson in the Western colonial territories. Problem is, they needed to march in their straight lines and their perfect formations and do all that. Well, there's no way to do that through the wooded areas. So as they made their way out to Fort Duquesne, they built a road, Braddock's Road. And I can just imagine, clearing this territory, because they're doing this pretty much by hand. I mean, it's axes, it's, if they've got saws, they're powered by people. They're hand saws. They're using picks and shovels to clear, but they make themselves a road all the way out from Virginia to western Pennsylvania. And when they had their first major confrontation with the British in July of 55, Braddock and his men were soundly defeated. It's because the British are going to fight the way the British fight. They're going to fight in their bright red coats, standing out like a sore thumb in the middle of the woods. They're going to fight in their tight formations, and the natives and the French fought more of a guerrilla style. They're going to hide behind trees and rocks and from cover and fire, and the French are going to be much more effective the first 2 years because of these tactics. It's going to take some time before the British finally realize that the open field style of warfare that had made them so powerful because they were so good at it throughout Europe wasn't going to work in the wilderness of the frontier. May of 56, we get the formal declaration. Finally, England and France are going to go to war. And again, England really was trying to avoid going to this war because fighting the French meant fighting in multiple continents. It's going to be fighting around the world. This is expensive. There's a cost factor to this. And it took 2 years of us fighting here in the colonies before they were ready to finally say, fine, let's go and get this over with. Now, from the onset, the French are going to have an advantage. And again, it's tactical. The British, their leadership is not going to, there's a cockiness, there's an arrogance here. We fight this way, and this is how we're going to do it. And we're really not going to see a change until William Pitt takes over. When William Pitt is placed in charge of the British war effort, we started to see a change. He got rid of some of the old school leadership. He brought in new leadership, more flexible people who were able to fight the way the war needed to be fought and won here in the colonies. He was able to negotiate with Native American groups. He was able to basically flip, if you will, the Shawnee. He flipped some of the Iroquois. I mean, he's going to bring some of these tribes that had been with the French, he's going to bring them over to the British side. And most importantly, Britt had a respect for the colonies. He had a respect for the colonists. He didn't just ignore the colonists. He didn't just assume that they were going to do exactly what they're told. He treated them with a level of respect that he's going to get more out of them. 58, you have the with this transition of power, we have Jeffrey Amherst, who's one of the young guys that was brought in. He's going to take Louisbourg, which we know was important to our activity in class. And they talked about that being specifically dealing with trade and getting supplies into the French camps. Louisbourg was a key outpost for us to take. Fort Frontenac, Quebec was a big battle, and again you read about that with James Wolfe and the way he spoke French to the sentry to trick him. And then once they got to the Plains of Abraham, the British were able to fight the French, the British were able to fight the French on a level playing field, if you were. In the Plains of Abraham, they were able to fight in the manner which the British were well suited, and combination of them fighting their way and the French just making some disastrous decisions at Quebec, it's going to be a victory for the British. Followed up by a victory in taking the surrender of Montreal. And now it's just a matter of time before they get the treaty negotiated. Now with the Treaty of Paris 1763, one thing I want you to take note of there is who is not listed as far as signers of the treaty. It's the Native Americans. The Native Americans, which made up such a large part of the fighting force for the French, are not going to be participants in the peace treaty. They're going to be left out of this. Now, as far as the gains, England gained French lands in Canada and the lands from the Mississippi to the Appalachian Mountains. That's the part we wanted. That's the part we were, in conflict with the French. England will gain Spanish Florida. Now, Spain will get that back after the American Revolution. Spain received French lands in the west of the Mississippi River, which we would consider Louisiana Territory. But again, there's nothing there about what the Native Americans get, because the Native Americans weren't going to get anything. It's still that European arrogance, that superiority complex. They were not going to negotiate with their inferiors. And to them, the Native Americans were just that. So this brings us to the end of Part 1. The end of this colonial period and the beginning of the revolutionary period from colonies to revolution. The Native Americans don't just sit back and wait. They don't just sit back and take whatever the British are going to hand out to them. There are going to be rebellions, and the big one is Pontiac's. Pontiac is an Ottawa chief, and he rebels against the British rule in their territory. The British are going to bring in the troops. They're going to put down Pontiac's rebellion. But what the British realize in crushing Pontiac's rebellion is they're going to have to deal with these Native Americans, especially if the colonists try to settle this new territory. Now, before the French and Indian War, for the most part, we didn't strike out past the Appalachian Mountains. That was kind of the western boundary for the colonies. Now this land is ours, outright. There is no disputed claim. We are British subject, and this is controlled by Britain, and we're going to go colonize it. I mean, we were excited. But again, England has an ulterior motive. If we crossed over into the Trans-Appalachian West, it was going to be harder for them to tax us. See, the British had already decided the plan of action. They were going to pay for this war by taxing the colonies. And it's going to be harder to tax us the more spread out we are. On top of that, if we spread out into these areas, we were going to come into more conflict with Native Americans, which meant we were going to have to. They were going to have to do something about that. Wars cost money. And if you're not able to collect taxes, there's a loss in revenue there as well. So, in order to solve this little problem that this new territory had given them, they pass what's called, or they issue what's called the Proclamation of 1763. Basically, they draw a line on the map, and it's right around the Appalachian Mountains, and tell the colonists, you can't cross over into that territory. They restricted our movement. We had fought, we had bled, we had lived and died, during the French and Indian War for the 9 years, not just the 7 years that were official. For the 9 years, colonists were fighting to gain access to that land. And now that we had it, now that it was ours, they told us we couldn't go there. They were trying to control us. Colonial resentment. Why? This is the end of salutary neglect. This is, the 1760s. This is, the adult population in the 1760s. They didn't remember the old way. They didn't remember the 1650s. They weren't part of the Navigation Acts. These were people who grew up during salutary neglect. They grew up during a period where we had the right to do what our colonies thought we should do, what our colonial governments said we could do. Now all of a sudden, England's telling us what we can and can't do. And that was not going to go well. So, that's the end of part one of this. I will put the other part together, the American Revolution aspect of from colonies to revolution, and get that posted for you hopefully soon.